I am so honored and humbled to be out here today, and I want to tell you a story about some really fascinating scientific discoveries about burned forest, and have changed my view of what a forest is. And I thought I knew what a forest was after 30 years of being in them. I've been blessed by working all around the globe in these amazing forest landscapes and the tropics, temperate, boreal systems. And so I had this kind of vision of what I thought a fire was. And I'm going to tell you something different tonight that may be a bit of a surprise to you. I'm also going to talk about what do we mean by recovery. Think about that, recovery. We use that word a lot, but let's just kind of see what it looks like from the standpoint of nature and from the standpoint of wildlife that depend on these fire-adapted forests. And so here's the kind of saying up there. You've heard this before: if a tree falls in a forest, does anybody hear it? What about a dead tree? If a dead tree falls in the forest, does anyone hear? Well, I did, and I started paying attention to this, and I'm going to tell you this story about it. So there's going to be some really interesting factoids in this presentation. Okay, so let's get the sucky thing out of the way. Smoke really sucks, right? And I was down in Ashland this summer, right around August, the Chetco bar fire broke out. I wrote an op-ed in the Mail Tribune saying that this was a very healthy fire. It was a very good ecosystem event. It was happening during decent fire weather. The fire hadn't turned, actually it was in July when this was happening. We hadn't turned incredibly dry then. And the fire actually was burning in this mosaic. And then it changed. We got hot temperatures. It was 115 degrees in the Illinois Valley in Southwest Oregon. The wind started kicking up and the whole fire grew rapidly. And the smoke filled the valleys. And, you know, for 2 months, people were walking around with masks to breathe. And my softball games were getting canceled. Picnics were getting canceled. People weren't going outside. It was truly, it wasn't a good situation. So let's acknowledge the human component, the human element, the loss that we visualize when we think of forest as green. It's all real. So we heard that from other speakers. What I'm going to try to tell you tonight is what's really happening behind the scenes with nature when the smoke is gone, when the fires are out. It's a good time to be talking about fires right now, by the way, because it's raining. And this is when I get the most interest in the ecology of forest fires. Don't do this talk in the summertime. Okay, so here's where my story begins. I had just finished a book on rainforests of the world, temperate and boreal rainforests of the world. So I thought I knew what a forest was. And I took a hike with my then 9-year-old daughter to the East Antelope severe fire outside of Ashland. This fire burned in 2002. You can see it was a severe fire. Beautiful sunny day, early spring, just when the snow had melted. We sat there on a log and ate our lunch. And as we're eating, my 9-year-old says, "Wow, Dad, look at this, dragonflies, butterflies, all these songbirds and woodpeckers. This place is just alive with wildlife." And so I started pondering, okay, if a 9-year-old can see it, maybe a member of Congress can get an understanding of this. Man, was I wrong. What a big mistake that was. We've already heard about what Greg Walden thinks of these places, but there's an ecology going on here, and you can kind of see that little sign there on the right. That's not from the same area. It's kind of image on top of an image, but it's from a coastal rainforest out in Oregon, out on the Rogue Siskiyou National Forest. Wildfires destroy green forests. That's the message. It's subliminal. It's in everything we read, it's in the media, it's in the stories about fire, but nobody really goes out there to take a look. What's really going on? So I started to think about that question, and because I was educated by my 9-year-old, I started calling other scientists up and said, what do you think about this? Can we get together and look at this issue and put it together in a book? And so that's what we did, and we had examples from all over the world about these forest ecosystems that need fire for their ecology. And that brings me to this. And some people may look at this and say, well, the gorge is destroyed, it'll never be the same, it needs to recover. Really? What about the system or the species that depend on fire? And so I had to throw a dinosaur picture in there, right? There's some kids in the audience, they love dinosaurs. There's my dinosaur photo, okay? Jurassic Park. It's actually up there just to point out there is a long association between fire and vegetation. It goes back 400 million years. Plants and fire co-evolved. They need each other. And plants are adapted to fire. This has been going on for a very long time, and it's been going on in the gorge for a very long time too. And as you've heard Michael point out, the big fire that was in this region, the Yacolt burn that occurred in 1902, this is some of the scenes back then. This is a view from Mount St. Helens, and you can see the amount of high severity fire that burned in this system. So, you know, fire is not a new visitor to the gorge. It's been here for millennia, and these forests are quite adept at being able to respond to fire. And so I started thinking, okay, we hear Smokey the Bear. What's a good symbol for getting the message out? And I had just finished watching Harry Potter's Order of the Phoenix. So they said, okay, that's it. It's a phoenix. And so when you open up the chapter of the book, it starts with that. It talks about the mythological relationship of the phoenix, that this old bird sits on a nest, faces the sunlight, burns itself up in an act of what is apparent suicide, but it really isn't, because out of the ashes is the next generation. That was the symbol for the book. And so you can see the flames here with a seedling that has come out of this very intense fire, the phoenix, which rises from the ashes, and you know, just like dinosaurs, I had to throw Harry Potter in there, keep the interest level going. And so I worked with 28 scientists around the world, and we started to look at examples in Africa, in Australia, in Canada, in Western United States, and in Europe. Are these systems responding in a pattern that we can understand? What are some of the new discoveries? You guys are going to find that out. Okay, so take you back to what my perception of a forest was going into this project. This is a rainforest from one of my earlier books from British Columbia. So this is what I thought a forest was until my 9-year-old told me, nah, you got it all wrong, Dad. This is also a forest. And we refer to this as a snag forest. You can see all the dead standing trees in there. And the fire didn't destroy this forest. The forest was rejuvenated by it, because these dry forests, in the dry forest, fire is to dry forest as rain is to rainforest. They need each other. Life and death are joined at the hip in these fire events. So again, here's what my view of a forest was, and here's what a high severity burn in a forest looks like. These trees are the most valuable parts of the ecosystem. You cannot get the new forest without these trees. They anchor the soils, they shade the vegetation in the understory so that when the seedlings are coming back, they're not cooked by intense sunlight. They also provide habitat for scores of insect-eating bats, birds, mammals, you name it. They're joined together. And so this is a slide that I show in a lot of my talks, and I ask people, what's more important, this forest or that forest? The unburned or the burned? Well, they're both important, and they're both connected. They're part of the stages that a forest goes through, and that is necessary for the ecology of these dry forest systems. And so most of my career is working on biodiversity, the fabric of life. And biodiversity, you know, the famous quote by the scientist Edward Wilson is, God must have had an affinity for beetles, coleopteran, because there's so many of them out there. And so we look at biodiversity in a lot of different scales. We look at it at the scale of individual species, at the scale of ecosystems, at the scale of biomes. And fire gives us that view of biodiversity in those different scales. Okay, so this is a term that I like to play around with. It's PYRODIVERSITY begets biodiversity. I wanted to name the book PYRODIVERSITY, but when I looked it up on Google, it said that it's somebody that likes to start forest fires. Not a good thing. The publisher said, no, don't do that. But PYRODIVERSITY in this sense refers to this kind of mosaic, the quilt that you heard about from the film. And when we look at this as an ecologist, that is really cool. So if you are a deer or an elk, you're going to find habitat in that newly created forest. If you're a spotted owl, you'll hang out in the places that are fire refugia, that didn't cook in the blaze, and you got everything in between. That kind of variety is the spice of life that we get from a forest fire. And here's what it looks like. So you got all these different critters that turn up in a forest fire, and it's connected, because these are the legacies that are hanging around after the fire that are connecting the stages to old growth. So in the new forest, the snag forest, you've got all these different birds, butterflies, bats that use the snags, all kinds of fire-dependent plants, deer, all kinds of insects. And anybody that goes out morel hunting knows that the best places to get morels are in a newly burned patch. So pretty cool. These, in terms of these species, recovery happened after the green forest burned. Remember I said I was going to talk to you about recovery, but if you're a fire-dependent species, that forest was recovered from a green forest. And so you get all of these plants that are dependent on fire systems and rapid revegetation that comes back even in the most severe burn patches. All kinds of pollinators that come in. Some really cool beetles. Returning to the beetle example again, we've got some examples of beetles that have special infrared receptors on their antennae that they can detect where a fire is occurring from miles away. They fly in as soon as the smoke is gone, and they start boring into these trees, and they keep going from fire to fire event. They're very fire dependent on that newly created forest, and then they supply food for the birds. This is a blackback woodpecker that is cryptically colored. Look at the black of that background against the black of a recently charred tree. So if you're a predator, you're not going to find that bird. And it's looking for those beetles that came in with the receptors. And so from the standpoint of this bird, recovery happened when the snag forest was created from the green forest. So again, it depends on what your perception is. See nature through the eyes of nature, through the eyes of a 9-year-old, and you get a different perspective. Bluebirds will then come in and nest in the cavities that were drilled into the dead tree by woodpeckers. And then you've got this whole web of life. You can see the hawks here with 3 chicks in the nest in a recently burned area feeding on this kind of menu of small mammals that are coming into the burnt forest. So here's one of the big surprises, right? I've also worked on spotted owls in my career in Oregon, and I trained myself for, okay, spotted owls, old-growth forest, one and the same, right? So some exciting discoveries on spotted owls now in the southern part of the range, down where I live in southern Oregon. They're actually doing quite well in these big burn patches. And it's kind of, we call it the bedroom and the kitchen phenomenon. So you get this patchwork of a fire mosaic. The places that didn't burn is the bedroom. That's where the nest sites are. The places that did burn is the kitchen. That's where all the prey is. So this owl is actually more resilient than we have given it credit for, particularly in these dry forests. How else could it be along the dry crest of the Cascades and in southern Oregon if it didn't adapt to forest fires? Okay, so things are changing, right? And so if you don't believe in climate change, you better leave the room right now. And I know Greg Walden doesn't, but I certainly do. And here's what's going on in our region, by and large. We're seeing forests that are drying out longer, over longer periods. Temperatures are going up, almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970 has been the average annual temperature increase. And then we've got declining snowpack. So when you have all of these factors going on, guess what's going to happen to wildfires? The wildfires track climatic patterns. The drier, the hotter the conditions, the more fire activity we're going to have. And in places in the West, we're going to see more of these conditions and more fire activity resulting from a changing climate. And so you've heard from other speakers that this is what people like Congressman Walden want, and also Bruce Westerman. I just testified in the House Natural Resources Committee last month on the Westerman bill. If you think the Walden bill is bad, try Walden across all the national forests, and you got Westerman. And so what they want to do is turn this phoenix into what the real disaster is that happens after a fire, the post-fire clear-cutting. This is an image from Southwest Oregon in one of the big burn complexes, and I've done some studies on this, looking at thousands of fires, and we see the same thing. When you have a landscape like this, it becomes a fire bomb. So the plantations are incredibly flammable because all the trees are tightly packed and there's a lot of logging slash left on the ground. That's where you get the big, intense fires. Okay, so should we log Eagle Creek? Okay, to save it or restore it. Okay, we know it's not going to save it. And if you believe me, that if you look at the forest from the perspective of the species that need fire, it's already been restored. It may not be our favorite place to hike anymore, but come back in 3, 5, 10 years, and you'll see incredible transformations, remarkable activity happening in the forest. It's as diverse as an old-growth forest that we all love. And what can we do about it? Well, we've got to think about how we plan our communities and whether or not building in fire sheds is a smart idea. And then we got to think holistically. And so there are some times when we have pretty good weather conditions that we need to work with fire instead of waging war on fire. That means corralling it in places, letting it burn in places, suppressing it where it comes too close to towns and communities, working more with it as a tool like the Native Americans did. Suppression and home safety is the biggest objective, saving lives, doing some prescribed burning, and thinning the fire bombs. If we're going to do thinning, this is the place to do it, and not taking out the big trees. Okay, so I'm going to end with this slide. We've heard others talk about Smokey the Bear, and I want to replace Smokey with nature's phoenix. And there's a nice little quote up there from John Muir. You can read it yourself and just kind of see how, you know, this is not the end. A forest fire is the beginning. It's a forest that has been reborn in a biblical sense. So I would ask that the next time you go hiking to one of these places, keep your mind open and your heart open and your ears open. Because if you're open to viewing this the way nature is happening out there, you might have a different perspective that it's not a disaster ecologically, But it's really a remarkable landscape that's dynamic, it's constantly changing, and if we let it go through the natural processes, I mean, maybe not in our lifetimes, but in our children's lifetimes, it's going to be as incredibly beautiful as the gorge you remembered in your lifetime. So thanks again for having me here, and I really appreciate all these people that turned out.